Alright, how's it going, Neil? So today we're going to talk about 5 awesome features that you probably didn't know about because honestly I've not made videos on in a while or haven't made them at all on how to use your Synology NAS as a real server. This is kind of for the home lab environment and the business environment where it's not just the office file server, which Synology DSM is awesome at. These are features and things that can make it into a full-blown server where it's taking the job of like a Windows domain controller, a web server, and so many other things that it actually does really well. This goes all the way across to also having network isolation and virtualization, where you can even start setting up things where you have multiple instances of DSM running, all under one version. So if you need to reboot one of them, it doesn't take out the other ones. And so this is really going to be focusing on kind of that web hosting level, as well as that kind of small business, home lab, really setting up a network that can do a lot of things. And the very first thing I'm going to talk about is also one of the best features is Synology's implementation of a DNS server. Okay, so if you've never used a DNS server before, essentially what that is the thing that resolves www.google.com to an IP address that your computer can understand and actually go to. And so the reason this is so powerful to have in a local network is now you no longer have to remember any IP addresses whatsoever. And it doesn't matter if your router supports having its own DNS server. Instead, you can set it up all by yourself. And now, instead of remembering that the IP address of the NAS is 192.168.1.43, or that this computer that you want to remote desktop into is on 10.30.20.10. Instead, you can just remember your own domain names and call it computer1.sr.spacerex.co, and boom, you're able to hit it and act as that. DNS is also really useful for failover. Say you've got 2 NASs running, a main and a backup, and you've got to do some maintenance on the main NAS, but you've got the ability to fail over to the secondary NAS. Well, all you have to do is, instead of actually changing the IP addresses around, all you do is you update your DNS pointer. So now, whenever somebody tries to connect to the NAS, they're actually just routed to the second NAS, and they have no clue. There's so many useful things that Synology has with DNS, and so I'm just going to go ahead and install that right here and just show you what it is. So within the package center, we can go into DNS and install our DNS server. So I'm going to give a pretty quick overview of this. I've done a full tutorial on it in the past, but this is actually one of the best implementations of a DNS server that I've seen in a long time because it's just a really nice web interface for bind DNS. So you can actually sync this to multiple NASs. You can have primary, secondary, all these different types of zones, and even reverse zones. There is so much stuff you can do with this, and it makes it really powerful. So what I would recommend doing is buying your own domain and then choosing a subdomain of that to host on here. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a primary zone. And it is going to be a forward zone, but we can also do a reverse zone I'll show. And I own the domain spacerex.co. So for this, I like to use a subdomain of that. So that way, you know all your local stuff is a subdomain and anything you do here won't interfere with like your website or anything like that. And you can easily tell if something's a local asset or remote asset. So what I'll do is create the domain .ln for local network. That's what I do. That's spacerex.co. And then the primary DNS server would be the IP address of this server. So you would want to have a static IP address and all of those lovely things on there. But we're just going to kind of rush through this, just kind of show you how it works. You can also set up a secondary zone notification. And so what this secondary zone notification will do is anytime you update a record here, it'll actually send a notice to these lists to say, hey, by the way, the main DNS server has said that this is now on .3 instead of .4. And now your second NAS that you're using as your backup will automatically get updated anytime you edit anything on here. Really, really powerful. And this is stuff that I am currently doing with just SSH commands that would be so much easier using this. I want to learn how DNS really works, so I set up with bind on my own servers and had it on a Raspberry Pi and a whole bunch of stuff. But if you've got 2 NASs and are a business, this is absolutely awesome. And I would highly recommend running your own DNS. It is really useful. So then after that, we can go ahead and say what our resolution rules are. And we want to say that, hey, we're going to forward any queries that we don't know to an upstream server. And what this will do is if this gets requested something that's not in our list, it will send it on up to an upstream DNS server. And so that way, if you ask this thing where Google is, it'll still be able to give you an answer, even though we don't dictate where Google is. I'm going to kind of rush through this because I forgot a video on it. That'll be linked down in the description below. But now, this thing is ready for us. If you are going to use DNS, I would highly recommend having at least 2 DNS servers because DNS is a critical component to the internet. If your DNS servers go down, it is the equivalent of your internet being down. And so anytime you set up a DNS server, if you're going to use it, you need to make sure you've got 2 of them, a primary and a secondary. That way, if the primary is rebooting, all your employees or your wife can all connect to the internet still. And even though the NAS is down, it doesn't take out the rest of the internet as well. And that is where you would have that secondary zone that you can configure very easily. Now let's go ahead and add in a record. So we'll go ahead and add in our records here. As you can see, you've got all your options that you would need. We're going to do like fs01 is what I normally like to do. So fs01.ln.spacerex.co is going to be this right here. And we're just going to type in an IP address. But then we can also add in one for router.ln.spacerex.co, and that's going to be 10.30.0.1 in my case. You can add CNAMEs, you can add so much stuff on here, you can add computer names. DNS is awesome. You've seen my other videos about home lab stuff. You probably have seen how I do everything with DNS because it makes it so easy to update stuff and remember where everything is. Really, really useful to have. So we can see that we've got this all set on up. And now what you would do is you would put in the IP address of your primary and your secondary DNS servers, the IP addresses of your NASs, into your router under the DHCP DNS servers. What that will do is every single time a new device hooks up to the network with DHCP, it's going to ask your router, hey, what IP address do I use for the DNS server? And it will tell it to ask the NAS. Instead of doing that, I'm just going to quickly go ahead and do the similar thing by actually doing it manually under our network settings, which you can also do here as well. You can see that right here under DNS, I currently use my own 2 DNS servers, but instead we're going to use the one that we just set up there and test some things out. So first off, can we hit Google? Good, it is successfully requesting zones and checking stuff out. But now let's try this out. So instead of remembering our IP address for the router, let's just go to router.ln.spacerex.co. And you can see, just like that, I was brought directly on into my router. I can do the exact same thing with FS01. And you can see, just like that, I was brought in to DSM. There's so many devices you can do. And now when you're mapping network drives, you can do the exact same thing on in there. And this is just really powerful, and there's tons and tons and tons of features. A really great place to use this as well is the VPN server. So you can actually configure your VPN server to then use these DNS requests within the OpenVPN configuration file. So that way all this stuff continues to resolve no matter where you are. By the way, VPN server is an honorable mention for this. The reason I left it off is you probably already have used VPN server and seen a zillion videos on it. I really wanted to kind of focus on stuff that's not always in the public eye because they're really useful things that the NAS can do that make it a lot more powerful. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to go ahead and set up is critical for that failover case I was talking about, and that is a way to manage our users. So the NAS makes it really easy to have local user accounts, but what if you want to be able to plug this into other services? What if you want to be able to have the same sign-on for the router as well as a web application as well as the NAS? Well, that's where the NAS has 2 different options that can do this. You can use either LDAP server. LDAP is standard. LDAP works across a ton of different devices and is not tied to any specific implementation. And LDAP server works really well for user authentication. Most devices can hook up to an LDAP server for authentication, and it is set up there. I've got a video on that as well that I'll link down in the description below. But it allows you to do a ton of really useful things to sync your users. And so now if you got two different NASs and you want to be able to fail over between the two, or you just want people to be able to use the same accounts on both of them, set up the LDAP server and boom. Now that is your authentication method. Really useful. And I'll leave a link down in the description below that. The other option for this is what's called Synology Directory Server. So Synology Directory Server is what we're going to be installing here. It is actually a drop-in replacement for Windows Active Directory. This actually uses a really cool thing about the Samba open source project is Samba is not just Windows File Explorer and SMB cloned to Linux. Samba also works with Active Directory and can make its own Active Directory server. Windows Active Directory also uses DNS, so it actually would install that as well. And if we open it on up, you can actually create a read-only domain controller that works as if it was a 2008 Windows server. There are a ton of things you can do here, and this is a huge money saver. And it's a great way to learn about how Active Directory works if this is in your home lab. Because as you might know, to run Active Directory, that server license for Windows Server 2022 is about $2,000 to buy. This comes with your NAS and can do a lot of that key capability because you can interact with it from your Active Directory tools on Windows. So you don't even have to have a full-blown Active Directory license and pay all that money to do this. So you can create your forest, and this is where having that full network. So I would create ad.spacerex.co, ad, and create a password. Really recommend making this a domain you own. Now, this is where you'd want to create a static IP address, basic networking stuff, but it'll still let us override that. Now, I will say, this is not as fully functional as the modern versions of Active Directory are. There are some features and things that are missing here, but for a small office environment, it does pretty much it all. It's got the ability to have a roaming directory, your startup scripts, all the basics are there. And so, especially if you just need a few basic things and you want everybody to be able to log into an AD, this is a really useful tool to deploy because, as I said earlier, $2,000 for a single license that is good for maybe 4 or 5 years before you've got to get the next version. Remember, AD uses DNS, meaning you need 2 Active Directory servers if you're going to run a business properly because you don't want everybody's internet to go out just because one of the domain controllers is rebooting. So that's $4,000. It gets really expensive to run Active Directory, and this is absolutely something to check out and see if you can use because it can do so much. I am really impressed by the functionality of this. I have hooked up a TrueNAS box and used that authentication with this, and it worked flawlessly. So it's really something to check out and see, and it's a great way if you're a home labber to learn how Active Directory works without having to spend that money on that license, and it's just something you can spin up really easily. If we look in at our DNS settings, we will see that it's actually adding in all of these DNS records that are required to run Active Directory. So you can see that there's this AD right here, and it's all managed by that. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that Active Directory does with DNS, and that's a key part of it is actually having resolution for everything, but you can continue to add your own records. Another thing that's happened is it has also joined us to the Active Directory domain. So now we are actually using ourselves as AD, and it's a great way to test all this stuff on out. You can add in your basic domain policies, add in all of your regular devices. As you can see, if you've ever used AD, these are your same built-in groups. Furthermore, you can add in your users here. They can literally log into Windows with this credential. It is a full-blown Active Directory and can be set up, and you add in all your user groups to wherever you need them to be. Then you've got your basic domain policy right here, your lockout and all that stuff. But what you can also do here, which is really nice, is you can actually hook this up to Active Directory tools to do further things. So it supports everything that the Samba Active Directory allows you to do as well. And we can look at the features. We can look at all of our features under Synology Directory Server and go through all those pieces here. There's a whole lot of stuff you can do. And they even have the full-blown paper on everything you need to know about setting this thing on up. And it's definitely worth a look. And you can go in and set up all of your different pieces here and use those Active Directory tools on any Windows box to actually hook up to it. This is something you should not jump into right off the bat unless it's kind of in a test environment. But if you understand how AD works, it's a great place to get started without paying those massive license fees. All right, so that was number 3, is setting up the NAS as either an LDAP or an Active Directory server. And that's where it can really start acting as a server in the sense that most people think of a server versus a NAS, because now it's controlling your entire network. The next thing we want to talk about is kind of on the flip side, and that's for web hosting. These things have an unbelievably useful reverse proxy. So what a reverse proxy does is a reverse proxy allows you to manage all of your SSL certificates or run multiple websites on a single domain. And it has a lot of security protection built into it because now those web servers are not going to be directly accessible from the internet. Instead, they're only accessible through the proxy. And so not only does somebody have to know the connection, they actually have to go through with the proper domain name to get to those services. And so it can hide a lot of insecurities and kind of block out a lot of stuff from happening because you have to go through the reverse proxy first before actually even hitting the true web server. And they can also be used for load balancing, though I don't think DSM has load balancing built in. Another really useful thing that reverse proxies on DSM has the ability to do is manage SSL certificates really easily. If you ever run your own web server, you know how tough it is to get an SSL certificate. You've got to be understanding command line, and renewing the process is kind of tough. Even if you're using certbot, it's kind of tough to see where your certificate is. There's no nice user interface. But DSM has a phenomenal SSL certificate interface. It is incredibly easy to generate all of these certificates and grab one from Let's Encrypt really easily. So you can use all the power of your certificate manager directly from DSM and be able to host multiple websites on multiple different devices, all having SSL. You can also then use this to allow access to certain levels only. And I'm going to show all that here. So to do a reverse proxy on the NAS, you come to your login portal, advanced, and reverse proxy. Kind of confusing, right? It's a bit hidden back here, and that's why a lot of people don't know that it exists. But what this reverse proxy allows you to do is it allows you to take traffic into one place and send it to another, all based off of the host name. So say I wanted to use my router. So I wanted to proxy my router to here. Well, what I could do is anybody who's going to demo.sr.spacerex.co on port 80 will be redirected to port 80 of my router. So now, if I wanted to, I could open this up to the internet and have a rewrite here. Once again, there's a lot more here, and I've got a tutorial on it that I'll leave a link down in the description below. But these are some of the things you can do. And now I'm going to go into that step 1 that I talked about and edit our DNS record to say that demo resolves to the IP address of this NAS. So what's going to happen is when I go to this on my web browser, it is going to resolve me to the IP address of the NAS. Then my reverse proxy right here is going to see, hey, I was told anybody who's going to demo.sr.spacerex.co on port 80 should be sent over and proxied to this right here. And to do this, I'm also going to need one for HTTP and HTTPS because my router is going to do a rewrite. So this is where you've got to have 2 rules often if you want to be able to serve both HTTP and HTTPS traffic. But a cool thing we can do is we can reroute our HTTPS traffic to unencrypted HTTP. So that means that we don't have to have an SSL certificate working on the backend web server. Instead, we handle all of the SSL encryption on the front end, and then the data will be traveling unencrypted from our NAS to the server, but that will be over a local protected network. And so you don't have to have SSL on that. Then there's a whole bunch of other settings you can do and add in right there. All right, so now we've got demo.ln.spacerex.co, HTTP, and HTTPS both set up and ready to go. So let's go try it out. And boom, just like that, even though when I'm going here, I'm communicating with my Synology NAS, it is proxying the traffic to my router. And so that gives you the ability to start opening things up. But do note, you're now opening them up to the internet unless you want to add in access control lists to really manage out exactly what you do and do not want to be able to access, and all having it be proxied through the NAS. And so that way you can manage all your certificates and everything in one place. And so this is more useful if you've got 3 or 4 websites you want to be able to hit publicly and managing it all there. If you wanted to, you could also have websites that you want to have HTTPS on, but are only locally accessible. Then you can buy a wildcard certificate or go through and get a local Let's Encrypt certificate that's a wildcard and upload it to the NAS. And now, boom, all of these are going to be hosted off of that one certificate. And you can have locally things accessible with HTTPS using your different domain names. All right, so now in the exact same theme of this is setting up a website. So for number 4, we're going to be talking about how to really easily set up a website. And I think this is a really unappreciated feature because Synology WebStation is honestly one of the best utilities out there for just spinning up a simple website. It is really incredibly easy to set up and manage, and they've got WebStation, and a few other useful tools are going to be Apache, your PHP versions, PHPMyAdmin, and MariaDB. Those are the pieces that I use all the time whenever you're deploying a website, because this allows you to manage an entire website without touching any command line at all. And that is actually hosting it. That's not going to like a hosting provider and spinning up a website. You're actually hosting it and doing everything without any command line. So some really useful tools are going to be MariaDB, PHPMyAdmin to then host MariaDB, and a whole bunch of other features. I've got a bunch of videos on that I'll leave a link down in the description below too as well, because this can be an awesome stack to get started with a database. Built in is MariaDB 10, and they've got an application called PHPMyAdmin that make it incredibly easy to manage your databases. And the beautiful thing about it is no command lines needed. It's really easy to spin them up directly from the package center and manage all of that. And I'm just going to show that really quickly here. I've got videos, as I said earlier, that kind of go through how to actually deploy like a WordPress site or anything like that. But I really kind of want to focus on the critical components here is the database, and setting up the database tables is something that's really hard to do. And I think Synology DSM makes it incredibly easy. Then once you pair that with WebStation, Container Manager, the reverse proxy, and the certificates, these things become very powerful hosting boxes that you can really set up and manage so many things on and do it really well. So I'll also go ahead and install PHPMyAdmin. All right, so now that we've installed PHPMyAdmin and MariaDB, I want to show you how easy it is to manage your databases. Just click on PHPMyAdmin, log in with that root username and password that you set up in MariaDB. Then after that, you can create database tables, you can view statuses, you can create accounts, you can do everything incredibly easily, all without having to write a single line of SQL code, not even to create your users. This is incredibly useful for setting all this stuff up, and it makes hosting these websites really, really, really easy. There's tons of stuff there, and especially from a home labber perspective, or like a small business who just wants to run like a local CRM site, you don't even have to have these things be publicly accessible to get all the goodness from this. All right, so that was number 4. And I want to close out this video with number 5, and that is that everything I just showed you is also able to be virtualized. And that unlocks a whole lot of power, because not only do you get security, but you can also use this to deploy multiple things with multiple versions. So a thing that a lot of people don't know that you can do is you can actually deploy a virtual DSM instance. And I'll leave a link down in the description below to setting that up. I actually just did a tutorial that should have come out probably a couple days or a week before this one that actually shows you how to set up and deploy a virtual machine within Synology DSM, but a virtual DSM instance. And what this allows you to do is this allows you to spin up multiple copies of DSM. The first one's free. After that, there's a license fee associated with it. And this gives you so much power. Because now, if you want to run a few different websites or a few different components and you don't want them to have any interaction with each other, you can do that. You can also set it up so that one of them you use for tinkering. So say you want to learn how that domain controller works and you want to be able to kind of blow it away and rebuild it really quickly and easily. With virtualization, that's so easy because you can just snapshot the entire system and roll it back. Another thing you can do is you can sequester your network out where maybe the NAS, the Synology, stores a lot of really sensitive, critical information that you want to be totally isolated from the internet. But you also want to use Synology Drive to be able to host files for the public, where you want to have it open up to the internet. Well, this allows you to do that. You can create a virtual DSM instance on its own DMZ VLAN, so one that only has internet access, and now you can have that port forwarding done to that, and the virtual DSM instance will have no ability to infect the host. So even if you're ultra worried about security and you want to make sure that your NAS is not publicly accessible, it's not. Only the virtual machine within it is, and so only those files could possibly be compromised, even if there's a massive security breach in your NAS. And so there are so many useful things you can do with virtualization with DSM that allow you to use all these features I just talked about in conjunction while being able to run them independently with each other. Whew. All right, well, I hope you found that interesting. These were all a lot of things that I think are really useful for building up a real network and taking a Synology NAS from being a NAS to being a server, even though in a lot of cases, they're really the same thing. But it allows you to do all those things that you would traditionally think of a server as doing, while all being in a very nice and neat and easy to use package. If you'd like to hire me, there's a link for that down in the description below. If you got any other questions or suggestions for other tutorials, put those down in the comments below. And have a good one. Bye.